question of this whole thing of rescuers and where not rescuers and where do you interdict. I mean, what he put in was really relevant starting point. And I think, again, you can...
So, ladies and gentlemen, if I can just ask you to take your seats so we can start our second panel of this day, which is about humanitarian space. We will not only define it, because there's different definitions for it, but our main purpose today is to discuss how you can live and work during conditions of war and how you can ensure there is humanitarian space. We will discuss it today on the example of the Central African Republic, and I'm very happy to have high-level guests here from the Central African Republic. Two men who work together in order to bring peace to communities, but they don't believe it is a sectarian war, which we will hear from them very shortly. To my left is Bishop Dieudonne Nzapalainga. I'm very sorry I got your name wrong again, it's very difficult. He's the Catholic Bishop of Bangui. Next to him, Layama Oumar Kobine. He's the President of the Islamic Council of the Central African Republic. These two gentlemen, as I said, go and work together to ensure peace or to build trust among the people, and they will tell us more about it, but they will first give us an overview of the situation in the country. To my right, Karoline Kleijer. She's an emergency coordinator for Doctors Without Borders, and she spent 9 months in the Central African Republic. Welcome to you. And to her side, Kathrin Schick. She's the director of Voice, and she has held various positions in humanitarian organizations before, and she will also give us her input. So before we start talking about humanitarian space and before we get it on a general level, can I please ask the two gentlemen to give their overview of the situation? And I think they have decided we start with the Imam, Layama Oumar Kobine, please.
Avant de commencer, je vais devoir m'acquitter, nous allons devoir nous acquitter d'un devoir, celui de remercier d'abord les organisateurs de cette panel.
So before we start, we'd really like to thank the organizers of this panel meeting here.
Qui nous ont fait l'honneur de venir présenter la situation de la République centrafricaine, qui n'est pas connue dans le monde entier, et surtout, je pense bien aussi par la population autrichienne.
Which have given us the possibility to be able to speak to you here about the situation in the Central African Republic, which is not very well known in the world and probably not well in Austria as well.
Notre pays, la République centrafricaine, est l'un des pays au monde qui a connu beaucoup de crises militaro-politiques.
Now, the Central African Republic is one of the countries in the world which has lived through several political military crises.
La toute dernière survenue dans le pays, notamment en décembre 2012, avec le phénomène des anti-Balaka, et celui des Sélec en 2012 plutôt, et celui des anti-Balaka en décembre 2013.
Now, this has happened actually in the country starting in December 2012 with the phenomenon of the Seleka and the anti-Balaka in December 2013.
Cette crise a entraîné beaucoup de dégâts humains et matériels avec de nombreuses conséquences.
And this actually is a crisis which has produced a lot of material damage and loss of human lives with very dire consequences.
Notamment des graves violations des droits humains.
Which is particularly a lot of violations of human rights.
Une recrudescence de l'insécurité, des tueries et exécutions sommaires.
A resurging of killings, of summary of mass killings, and coming back up of a lot of insecurity in the country.
Nous notons également la fuite des populations, non plus d'1 million de déplacés internes et externes, dont certains sont dans la bourse même et d'autres répartis dans plusieurs sites.
A lot of people have tried to flee. There is more than 1 million displaced people, internally and externally displaced.
Il faut noter également le pillage, les destructions des biens et les lieux de culte.
Some of these people have actually taken refuge in the jungle, in the woods, and others have also gone to other sites, and we're not even now talking about the situation of the looting and the destruction of cultural and religious goods and facilities.
Face à cette situation dégradante dans laquelle se trouve un plus grand nombre de la population, la situation humanitaire est extrêmement dégradante, d'où il faut noter, entre autres, deux grands défis.
Now being faced with this very difficult situation, which is coming from bad to worse, where many of the people live in, the humanitarian situation is also becoming very bad, and in this situation there are two major issues which I'd like to talk to you about.
Premièrement, le défi humanitaire.
So first of all, the humanitarian issue.
La situation humanitaire actuelle en République centrafricaine demeure préoccupante et aiguë, d'où il faut noter la pénurie alimentaire.
Now the current humanitarian situation in the Central African Republic actually remains very worrisome, and among many difficulties we must note that there is a food crisis as well.
Il faut noter également le manque de médicaments pour les soins de santé primaire, niveau de pauvreté élevé, ce qui a conduit la précarité de survie.
And we must also note that there is a flagrant lack of medication for the primary health needs of the people, and there is an increased level of poverty, and this has also led to a very dire situation of survival, we must say.
Il y a flambé de prix de denrées humanitaires de première nécessité.
The prices have unfortunately gone up, the prices for the primary foodstuffs.
Il y a également des milliers de personnes sans abri.
And there are also thousands of people who are homeless.
Un grand nombre d'enfants sans scolariser, faible croissance des produits agricoles.
And many children do live without a school education, and the agricultural production has stagnated and is not really going back to normal.
Par conséquent, il est urgent de prendre des mesures efficaces et ciblées en faveur de la réduction de la situation humanitaire sombre de ce pays meurtri.
This is why it is urgent to take efficient and very targeted measures in order to remedy the somber humanitarian situation in this country in distress.
Cette action s'inscrit également bien dans la stratégie et la vocation de la plateforme des confessions religieuses qui, depuis 2012, déploie des efforts et développe des initiatives destinées à améliorer le vivre ensemble de la population.
Now these activities actually come and are part of a vocational strategy of the Religious Confessions platform, the Religious Creed platform, which has come about in 2012 and is making efforts in order to, and has developed initiatives trying to help better the life situation of the people in the Central African Republic.
Le deuxième défi, c'est le défi sécuritaire.
Now the second issue is the security issue.
La République centrafricaine est divisée entre trois groupes armés.
The Central African Republic is actually divided into three armed groups.
Nous avons au sud-est la LRA.
In the southeast we have the LRA.
C'est les rebelles de Joseph Kony, l'Ougandais.
These are the rebels of Joseph Kony from Uganda.
Au centre-est, c'est la Seleka.
In the center-east are the Seleka.
Au nord-ouest et une partie du sud, les anti-Balaka.
Then we have the anti-Balaka in the northeast and in one part of the south.
Et voilà que ce pays se trouve dans une situation d'insécurité généralisée et grandissante qui ne favorise ni ne facilite pas les actions humanitaires.
Now this is to say that the country is in a generalized situation of insecurity, which is getting worse by the day, and which thus does not really promote and facilitate humanitarian activities.
Ceci rend l'accès difficile, l'accès aux victimes est rendu très difficile pour les humanitaires, et aux personnes affectées par la crise est devenu extrêmement difficile.
And this is why the access to the victims of this conflict has become very, very difficult.
La présence de ces groupes armés constitue un danger permanent pour les humanitaires.
Now, the presence of these armed groups is a permanent danger for the humanitarian situation and the humanitarian helpers.
La plateforme des confessions religieuses juge important et urgent que tous les humanitaires adressent des recommandations à la communauté internationale pour la réduction des taux d'insécurité afin de leur permettre d'avoir accès aux personnes en difficulté.
Now, this is why this interreligious platform is trying to remedy the situation and calls also upon the international community to help reduce the level of insecurity in the country, in order also to allow humanitarian workers to have access to the people in need.
Que Dieu le très miséricordieux protège et bénisse les humanitaires. Je vous remercie.
Let God help and protect the humanitarian workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just for all of you in the audience here who maybe aren't so familiar with the conflict in the Central African Republic, because it's not really on the map of our media, just as an explanation, the Seleka would be the so-called Muslim militias and the anti-Balaka would be the Christian ones. But the two gentlemen here on the podium don't believe this is actually a sectarian war. They believe it is armed groups abusing religion, and this is why they are working together. And let me now hand the microphone to the Catholic representative who is working for peace, which would be, I try again, Dieudonne Nzapalainga, the Catholic Bishop of Bangui, please.
À mon tour, je voudrais remercier et saluer tout l'auditoire.
I'd also like to thank you for being here and like to also welcome you to this conference.
Je vous adresse un bonjour de la part des Centrafricains. Souvent nous disons, nous sommes la voix des sans-voix.
Je vous comprends pas très bien.
Sie verstehen mich?
Nein, es ist sehr schwierig, die Akustik. Ich verstehe Sie auch fast nicht. Den Herrn habe ich gut verstanden. Ja. Aber ich probiere es weiter. Ja.
Wie machen wir das? Wollen Sie die Seite wechseln?
Ich glaube nicht, dass das viel bringt. Je vous comprends très mal pour l'acoustique. Donc, si vous voulez bien pointer où vous lisez, en fait, où vous parlez, on peut le faire. J'ai du mal à vous comprendre. Ou vous prenez le micro trop plus près, je sais pas. On va essayer de nouveau.
Je disais, nous sommes la voix des sans-voix.
I'd like to say that we are the voice of the people who don't have a voice.
Plusieurs fois, nous avons dit que la guerre en Centrafrique n'est pas une guerre religieuse.
We have actually reiterated many times that the war going on in the Central African Republic is not a religious war.
Nous, leaders religieux, musulmans et chrétiens, 5 jours après la crise, nous nous sommes mis ensemble.
Actually, 5 days after the beginning of this crisis, us religious leaders have come together to work together.
Nous avons décidé de faire des plaidoyers, de dénoncer et de condamner toute la violence et les tueries et les barbaries.
And we have actually spoken up with an advocacy against the killings and against this situation of war in the country.
Ni dans le Coran et dans la Bible, il est demandé de tuer ou de détruire la maison ou de voler.
Neither the Bible nor the Quran says that people should kill and destroy each other's houses.
Dans ce qui se passe au pays, c'est plutôt une guerre militaro-politique.
So this is why this war is not a religious war, but is rather a political and military war.
Un pays qui a un taux d'analphabétisme de 75%.
De combien?
75.
And this in a country where the illiteracy rate is 75%.
Et beaucoup de jeunes sont désœuvrés dans la pauvreté, la misère.
And many people, and many young people, if I understood this correctly, are actually living in abject misery and poverty.
Ce sont des proies faciles pour les aventuriers de combat et de guerre.
Which are actually easy victims for the people doing the war, engaged in war-like activities.
Voilà pourquoi tous ces jeunes ont été entraînés par les Seleka et les anti-Balaka.
And this is why so many young people actually were recruited by the Seleka and the anti-Balaka.
Dans notre pays, l'État a cessé d'exister.
And in our country, actually, the state or the government has actually ceased to exist.
Il n'y a plus de militaires, il n'y a plus de... Les médecins ni les agents de l'État ne sont plus dans les préfectures.
And actually, the government does not have any doctors anymore and people who care about the administration.
Ce sont les milices qui sont un peu partout et qui font la loi avec les armes.
It's actually the militia forces who are everywhere in the country and who actually hold the law prisoner with their arms.
Et quand il n'y a plus l'État, ce sont les humanitaires qui prennent le relais.
Comment?
Quand il n'y a plus d'État, ce sont les humanitaires qui prennent le relais. Qui les
And
remplacent.
actually, if there is no more government nor more administration, it's actually the humanitarian workers who take the role of the government.
Et nous avons vu que s'il n'y avait pas les humanitaires, la population centrafricaine devait souffrir davantage.
And we've actually seen that if there are no more humanitarian workers, the people in the Central African Republic would suffer even more.
Les humanitaires doivent avoir accès à la population pour mesurer leurs besoins.
And the humanitarian workers must have access to the population in order to find out about their needs.
Ensemble, étudier, voir les besoins et aussi décider ce qu'il faut faire pour aider la population.
So together with the population in need, they must find out about the needs of the population and together decide what needs to be done.
En même temps aussi, suivre et voir l'efficacité de ce qui a été décidé.
And they must also try to find out how efficient the activities taken are.
Avec les milices qui sont partout, la vie est devenue dangereuse.
And with the militia forces, which are almost everywhere, life has become extremely dangerous.
Les humanitaires prennent des risques en allant vers les populations.
And the humanitarian aid workers actually are taking great risks by trying to get to the population in need.
Alors que les humanitaires sont dans une impartialité, pour ne pas dire une neutralité.
And this is albeit the fact that the humanitarian workers are neutral.
Les milices qui sont ni foi ni loi
And the militia forces who do not respect neither creed nor law
arrêtent souvent les humanitaires pour prendre les véhicules, téléphones, tout le matériel.
and actually very often stop the humanitarian aid workers and take away all the foodstuffs, their telephones, cars and everything.
Que faire devant ces situations?
So what can we do confronted with this situation?
Nous, responsables religieux, avons décidé de demander à toutes nos populations de se laisser désarmer.
We as religious workers and humanitarian aid workers, we have decided to ask the people to lay down their arms.
Le vrai désarmement, c'est de l'esprit et de cœur.
And the real disarmament actually takes place in your heads and in your hearts.
C'est le désarmement le plus long
This is the most profound disarmament,
et qui demande beaucoup de patience.
which actually needs a lot of patience to be achieved.
Mais ensemble, nous avons décidé d'adresser des messages pour qu'on puisse sauver des vies humaines dans les lieux reculés.
But together we have been trying to do our utmost possible in order to save lives also in very remote spots of the country.
Nous pensons et disons que plus que jamais les humanitaires ont besoin d'avoir accès à des populations pour apporter la vie.
And we're saying that more than ever humanitarian aid workers must have the possibility to reach people also in very remote spots in order to help them.
C'est le sens de notre combat que nous menons à temps et à contre-temps.
This is actually the meaning of our struggle to help better the situation.
Nous espérons que les humanitaires continueront toujours à prendre le risque comme nous pour sauver des vies humaines.
And we hope that the humanitarian workers will continue to take those risks as we continue to take those risks in order to help the population in need.
Je vous remercie.
I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we heard a very dire picture about the situation in Central African Republic. No government forces there, militias everywhere, 8 organizations that take a very big risk. You spent 9 months there. How big was your risk? And can you tell us something about your work there?
Yes. I would like to start with a town in the northwest of Kar, Bokila, in April 2014. That day, at midday, a group of about 20-30 armed militia entered the town. They entered our hospital, where a meeting was taking place between different community leaders and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, to discuss the health situation in the area. The armed actors came in. We believe that they came there to loot the village and to rob Médecins Sans Frontières, who was helping the Minister of Health there with providing aid. They opened fire on the meeting and they killed more than 20 people. Among those 20 people were 3 of our health workers. It had a huge impact on the organization, on the village. Since then, MSF had to stop having a presence directly in the village with international personnel. But we did keep supporting it, but as we call that, with remote support from a town nearby called Bosrankoa. The reality in Kar also today is that villages are being burned, people are being killed by bullets and machetes, specifically in the rural areas. In those rural, people are being killed because of bullets and machetes, but in these rural areas, specifically outside of the bigger towns, but not only, a lot of people have no access to health care and are dying due to malaria, specifically children. That's the reality of today. The incident in Bokila, where 4 of 3 staff members were injured and got killed and died, did not stop us from working in the Central African Republic. Since then, we did more than 10,000 surgeries. We treated more than 300,000 people for malaria. We did more than 15,000 deliveries. And we continue activities today in towns like Bambari, where only a few weeks ago, again, more than 20 people were killed in similar fights. And again, several villages were burned down. Humanitarian space might be shrinking. Actually, you could debate that notion. Humanitarian space has always been a space we had to fight for, together with the population, together with all the actors, together with the politicians. It's not a given, it's not something you get. It's something you achieve by negotiating with all actors, by negotiating with armed militia, with state armed actors, but also with the criminals who are attacking you, hoping, and that is what it is sometimes, hoping that you manage to create that little space to actually provide the people with assistance. Because we have to be careful at times that when we talk about humanitarian space, we're not talking about the humanitarian actors, we're actually talking about people who have a right to receive assistance during difficult times. We cannot, I believe, simplify the conflicts where we work in. Certainly not Syria, but also not Kar. These are extremely difficult settings where nothing is being answered by a simplistic solution. It needs dedicated attention. It needs a constant reinvention on how we try to access population. And for that, you need to actually provide aid which is separated from other interests. You cannot mix political interests. You cannot mix economical interest in providing humanitarian aid. Because only when you come in with that pure, simplistic intent to provide assistance to populations at risk, you might have a chance to actually succeed it. And even then, the challenge will be big enough.
Thank you very much. Kathrin, Schick, Central African Republic, a very extreme example, but the only one?
No, first of all, thank you very much for being here, and just for you to know, Voice is a network which brings together humanitarian NGOs in Europe, 83 of them, and many of them are in the room here. So I'm working much more in advocacy and politics, in a way, to take forward exactly the things which our colleagues and Karoline also have just brought up. And I think the first thing is that there is not one solution which you can call a humanitarian space. Each country is different, and each complexity of actors is different, like Karoline already mentioned. And I think that is the big challenge, because each time all the actors have to sit together to actually find the best way of how to work. And what I think, what we see with the Central African Republic is, of course, a country where the development over long term has not gone the right way, and where you actually have no state authorities, which are the ones who are responsible, first of all, for their population and the needs of the population. And I think the Bishop said it very clearly. It is actually the humanitarian aid workers who take the role of states, of the government and institutions, and that is, of course, not what we should be doing. We should assist them. Now, so a long-term plan is very important, even when it is a conflict. And the longer we work there, and many NGOs work in countries of fragility and needs in development, and that is often maybe the best way of actually having trust and contact with the population. The other thing is that we need the security, and there is an issue which I would like to raise, which is that military and humanitarians are normally not going very well together. But what we see in conflicts, and if we want to continue to work in conflicts, and more than 80% of all affected populations are in conflict areas today, then we will actually have to liaise and find a way with how we work with the military. First of all, we have to have dialogue, and we have rather to have clear roles and mandates. I think this is the most important, and which absolutely donors and countries who send military forces really have an important role to play, that actually the military respects international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles, that they know about them, especially when they have a role to train the military and the police in the countries, like in CAR, for example. So this is very important, that in a way the military ensures security but does not become humanitarians. I think that's very important, because the debate is often also that the military affects on whether there is humanitarian space or not.
So you made the point, in some situations you can't help without military help. I would like to hand that question back to the two gentlemen. How important would a military intervention be in your eyes? I don't know.
Military intervention from outside.
Yeah, I don't know. Who would like?
Étant donné que nous n'avons plus de militaires en Centrafrique, comme nous n'avons pas de militaires en Centrafrique,
we don't have military forces foreign military forces in Central Africa.
Nous avons besoin d'autres militaires pour aider pour protéger la population centrafricaine.
And we'd need military forces in order to protect the population of the Central African Republic.
C'est pourquoi la MINUSCA, depuis septembre 2014, a été envoyée en Centrafrique pour protéger la population centrafricaine.
This is why actually in 2014 military forces were actually sent to the Central African Republic in order to protect the population.
Un pays, presque 2 fois la France, mais on n'a que 12 000, actuellement 8 000 militaires.
And this is a country which actually has twice the size of France, and we do actually have 8,000 soldiers.
C'est insignifiant, d'où la difficulté dans des villes pour pouvoir sécuriser
And this
les
is why it's so
humanitaires et les
difficult.
populations.
Sorry, this is why it's so difficult to get to a situation where there is security.
Nous-mêmes avons demandé à ce qu'on puisse reprendre les militaires centrafricains pour les former afin qu'ils apportent leur contribution à la sécurité du pays.
And we've actually also asked for a situation where Central African soldiers are trained actually in order also to protect the population.
Pour nous, c'est ça la solution à long terme.
This is actually our preferred long-term solution.
Je pourrais ajouter à ce que vient de dire l'archevêque que la présence des forces internationales chez nous a eu quand même un impact sur les groupes armés.
And I can actually corroborate this, that the presence of international armed forces in our country have actually exerted a lot of influence on the situation of the country and on the security situation.
Dans la capitale, il y avait 2 arrondissements plus dangereux.
They were actually in the capital of the Central African Republic. There were actually 2 parts of town which had a very difficult and dire security situation.
Le 5e et le 3e arrondissement, là, il n'y avait pas vraiment de circulation.
Il y avait pas de quoi?
De circulation.
And actually in the 3rd and the 5th district of the capital, there was no circulation. There was no possibility of transporting anything.
La présence des forces européennes dans cette zone a mis quand même la sécurité. Les gens commençaient à circuler, les marchés ont repris. Nous disons que cette présence vraiment nous a aidé beaucoup à remettre un peu les gens en confiance.
And this is actually with the help of the international armed forces in those districts where there was so much insecurity, so that people didn't even dare to go out on the streets, and goods couldn't be transported. With the presence of those external military forces, the situation became much better, and now people can go out again, and goods can be transported again in those districts. Thank you.
Before I go back to the ladies, but you also do your own work, right? You go to villages together and you are trying to convince men who joined militia to lay down their arms. Can you just tell us a little bit how this is, how we can imagine this? So there is the bishop and the imam coming to a village, and what happens then?
Vous faites en fait aussi votre travail, c'est que vous allez dans les villages pour convaincre les gens de laisser leurs armes, et comment est-ce qu'on peut imaginer ce travail que vous faites, aller dans les villages reculés pour convaincre les personnes?
En effet, nous allons dans les villages aussi ensemble pour convaincre les gens.
Yes, indeed, we go out to villages in order to actually convince people to lay down their arms.
Beaucoup de gens viennent volontiers vers nous pour se confier et exprimer leur situation.
And many of those people actually come to us in order to talk to us, tell us about the situation that they're living in.
Notre message consiste à demander aux uns et aux autres de déposer les armes pour reconstruire ensemble le pays.
And it is our task actually to try to convince the people to lay down their arms in order to reconstruct the country.
Actuellement, les gens sont prisonniers des armes et ils pensent qu'avec les armes, ils peuvent gagner leur vie.
And actually, for the time being, people unfortunately believe that with weapons are the only remedy, and with weapons things will get better.
Nous devons proposer une autre alternative.
And we have to propose an alternative to them.
En disant aux gens qu'il est possible de travailler la terre comme ils le faisaient comme paysans, en retournant à l'école comme ils le faisaient aussi, ou bien encore en étant menuisier.
And we actually must convince them that it is much better for them to come back to their previous lives, to go out into the fields in order to do agriculture, and also for the children to go back to school in order to get education. And also for people to go back to work altogether.
Can you maybe give us a concrete, one of the two gentlemen, a concrete example of what you have experienced when you came to villages?
Est-ce que vous pouvez
Tell us a story,
donner un
maybe.
exemple concret de vos expériences?
Ouais, il y a beaucoup d'exemples. Peut-être que nous n'allons pas citer tous ici.
Well, there are many examples that we could give to you, and it would be too long to tell you all about our experiences.
D'abord, nous avons deux cibles, la population et les groupes armés.
Of course, there are two target groups. It's the population and the armed forces.
Pour les groupes armés, nous allons vers eux, vers les Séléka comme les anti-Balaka, les rencontrer, pour les conscientiser, à désarmer leur cœur.
And actually, with the Seleka as well as the anti-Balaka, we go to meet them and we try to persuade them to listen to their consciences and to lay down their arms.
Et quand nous apprenons que la population, nos communautés veulent se rentrer instrumentalisées par les politiques et qu'ils veulent s'entretuer, nous allons vers eux, exemple, dans la ville de Mobile.
And for example, the people which were instrumentalized by the armed forces, we go also to the villages and we talk to them, as we have done in one case.
Là où les gens étaient à 2 jours pour rentrer en guerre, s'entretuer.
We go to the places where people were willing actually to enter the armed conflict.
Quand nous arrivons, les 3 leaders religieux, catholiques, musulmans, protestants, chacun va vers ses responsables de la localité. Donc l'imam va rencontrer les imams, l'archevêque va rencontrer les prêtres, le pasteur rencontre aussi les pasteurs.
So the way this happens is actually that when we go to those villages, each of us, and we're the representatives not only of Islam and the Catholic Church, but there's also the representatives of the Protestant Church, and when these representatives go out to the villages, they all talk to their people. Like the Archbishop goes to talk to the priests, and the Protestants talk to their ministers, and the Imam talks to the Imams out there.
Ensuite, nous les rassemblons pour leur donner l'occasion, quand même une seule fois, d'échanger, un espace pour échanger entre eux, parler de ce qu'ils vivent, les difficultés qu'ils vivent, pour qu'ils échangent entre eux.
And then we actually make them come together and talk to each other.
Ensuite, des fois, ils se retrouvent qu'ils sont tous victimes des groupes armés.
And very often we find out that all of those religious leaders in the villages are all also victims of this armed conflict.
Ils se réconcilient ensuite. Nous faisons un meeting avec eux, ils organisent un meeting avec toute la population où nous leur adressons la parole de paix, de cohésion sociale, du vivre ensemble.
And then we organize a meeting with all the inhabitants of the village and talk to them about their plight.
Et c'est ce travail que nous avons multiplié sur le terrain, que la crise n'a pas embrasé tout le pays et que Dieu a fait aussi éviter le génocide au pays.
And this is actually a work which we have done, which I think has helped to prevent genocide and to help parts of the population not enter the armed conflict.
Thank you very much. So, but small parts of the population, can rebuilding trust work this way from your experience?
I think Rwanda shows that there are definitely possibilities, and I think we should keep our hope. But what for me is more significant with these two men is the amount of guts they show. The amount, they take risks with what they're doing, and I think that's very impressive. And that brings me a little bit to the humanitarian actors and how much we dare to take risks. Because I think it's, talking about humanitarian space is good, but it's an illusion to think that we can do this work without accepting a certain level of risks in what we're doing. In the Central African Republic, the majority of the population is living in the rural area outside of the bigger towns, a significant amount of the population. Meanwhile, the majority of the humanitarian actors are more or less only in Bangui and a few bigger towns. We're often not there where it matters. Médecins Sans Frontières is working in more than 20 locations in the Central African Republic. And in these areas, you find the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, and Médecins Sans Frontières. Not many other NGOs, and let me be clear that there are more out there, you will find in the rural areas. And it's our duty to find ways to work in these areas, and it's also our duty as humanitarian actors to accept a certain level of risk, but also to make our organizations strong enough to actually work in these insecure environments. And there, I think we as humanitarian workers can improve. I think we need a strong focus in what we're doing. I mean, it's great to write reports in December 2013 at one of the highest level of violence in CAR about how well are we addressing the needs of the elderly and the handicapped people. How big is the female participation in our development of the long-lasting development programs? Of course, these are not areas we should exclude completely forever, but at a time when a huge amount of children are dying of lack of access to healthcare, dying of malaria, something which is very preventable, the moment that people are actually having hunger, are not having shelter, and are daily exposed to violence, we should, as a humanitarian world, focus. We need to have the guts to say, this is our priority. And when you make priorities, you also have to deprioritize. And that's what I think we sometimes lack. So I think there are many components to look at the crises of today. There are many conflict resolutions we need to do better. There's many politics we need to do better. But as a humanitarian actors, we also need to look at ourselves and see where we can be doing better. And that, I think, is in risk aversiveness, accepting a certain loss, how harsh it sounds, but also by having a better focus and about preparing ourselves better. And I would be also very interested to hear from the Imam and the Bishop where they think we can do better. And believe me, that includes Médecins Sans Frontières as well. Where can we do better?
I will hand that question back to them in a minute. But basically, you are saying some aid organizations are just too scared. They try to stay in the cities. They are losing focus of what is the priority. What do you think about it? Is that correct?
I think it's good to be self-critic, but I'm a little bit tired that we try, when the needs are so strong, that we not respect that everybody has a contribution to make. MSF does a fantastic work. I have a lot of respect for them, but there are at least 13 other of my organizations also working there, and I think they have as much motivation, as much humanitarian imperative, and I think it's more important that we see how we can complement each other than actually to just criticize each other. Coordination is extremely difficult. That starts with the UN, who is supposed to coordinate, and I think in CAR, I'm sure that both the NGOs and the donors have to coordinate much better and can coordinate better. But I think still that we also have to start, I mean, we can just stop and get totally depressed if we listen to all of it and we cannot do anything. So we have also to start where we can actually do something. And I think this thing of working together with our colleagues, I mean, the Bishop and the Imam are doing a fantastic work You find other similar initiatives also in other countries. It is the people on the ground who live there who have to start, like Yves Dacour said, and somebody else said also, institutions and peace have to be built by the people themselves. We can only support. But I think it's very important, and several here work together with the organizations also of these two representatives. So I'm really pledging for complementarity and actually dialogue in that, because we have so big challenges that we have to try our best. But I would still like to say something about the European Union and actually where one can do things. The Central African Republic was not on the list at all over humanitarian countries with need. It was a forgotten crisis until it flared up, the conflict, and suddenly it was there. But there was done a lot of the NGOs in Brussels, in the EU member states, in other places, to actually draw the attention to the Central African Republic. And that is also what has led to that there is at least some engagement from some donors, because money is an issue. And money, there is a lot of competition now also among UN agencies, among NGOs, etc. Maybe MSF is the only one who has enough money, who doesn't need anybody to take the money from. That is, of course, fantastic. I would wish I had the same situation. But I think that that is also important. Advocacy can create something. NGOs in Austria can push their government also to take a role and to take a position, for example, in relation to that CAR needs a long-term engagement from donors, from the UN, from NGOs, for example. So there are things we can do in all the hopelessness, and the biggest thing is to support really the people on the ground who live there and to work together with them.
Thank you very much. And I would now take the chance to hand this question back to the two gentlemen. So we also heard a little bit of self-criticism here about foreign aid organizations. So let me ask you, are they in the right places? Are they doing the right job? And what should they do?
Moi, je voulais encore insister pour dire que les humanitaires et les religieux doivent se compléter.
I'd like to really stress the fact that the people working in religious creeds and humanitarian workers actually must complete each other's work and must complement each other's work.
On fera une erreur en pensant que rien que par la voie humanitaire, on trouverait la solution.
And it would be a mistake to believe that only with humanitarian aid work we would be able to remedy the crisis.
On fera la même chose si on pense que rien que par la voie religieuse, on trouvera la solution.
And the same mistake would be made if we were to say that only through religion can the situation be remedied.
Nous devons plutôt apporter notre concours pour aider la personne qui est en souffrance.
We must actually work together in order to be able to provide real help for people who are suffering.
À la question posée, est-ce que les humanitaires en font assez? Je voulais dire, aujourd'hui, beaucoup des humanitaires travaillent au risque de leur vie.
And I must point out also that the work of humanitarian aid workers actually, they are actually having a lot of risk in what they're doing.
Et chaque groupe humanitaire a sa philosophie et aussi son organisation.
And each humanitarian aid group has its own organization and its own philosophy.
Parfois, on peut demander à un groupe de ne plus aller en province parce que la sécurité n'est plus assurée.
And sometimes we must also actually ask certain humanitarian aid groups not to go to certain places anymore because the level of insecurity is just too high.
Derrière ce genre de décision, il y a des enfants qui meurent de malaria.
And against the background of this type of decision, we must say that there are children also dying of malaria.
Il y a des gens qui sont oubliés, abandonnés entre les mains des milices.
There are lots of people who are sort of forgotten in between the field of the humanitarian aid workers and the militia.
Pour ma part, il n'y a pas une voie unique. Nous sommes là au risque quotidien.
And there is no immediate and unique solution to be found, and we're taking risks on an everyday level.
Qui ne risquent rien à rien, mais derrière les risques, ce sont des vies qu'on veut sauver.
But behind those risks, actually, we must also take those risks because this is the way we can save human lives.
But sorry, before we hand over to the Imam, there was a very concrete question in there. Aid organizations not going to villages. Would it need more foreign aid organizations in villages?
Est-ce qu'il faudrait plus d'organisations d'aide humanitaire, en fait, pour aller dans les villages?
En République centrafricaine, nous avons vu que le pays même est divisé entre les organisations humanitaires.
We have seen that the Central African Republic is also sort of divided into individual parts where the individual aid organizations are active.
Dans les zones des groupes armés, dans l'Est, l'extrême Est, dans le centre, dans le Nord, dans le Sud, dans l'Ouest, il y a tous des humanitaires.
There are humanitarian aid organizations in all of the country, in the north, the east, the center, the south, and the west.
Nous avons besoin de ces humanitaires.
We need those humanitarian groups.
Mais l'insécurité pose problème. C'est pourquoi nous avons dit qu'il faut nécessairement que les humanitaires unissent leur voix, joignent leur voix à la nôtre pour demander que ces groupes armés soient désarmés.
And but the insecurity level is so high that we have always said that we need to work together with the humanitarian groups in order to produce not only a ceasefire but for the people to lay down their arms and to end the armed conflict.
Certes, c'est vrai, nous religieux, nous circulons de fois dans le pays, mais si nous amenons aussi beaucoup de vivres dans les zones à risque, de fois, si Dieu ne nous protège pas, ces vivres-là ne peuvent pas arriver aussi aux destinataires.
And very often we travel into also remote areas, into villages, and we also provide books to those villages, and without the help of God we cannot do this.
Donc c'est l'insécurité qui est le grand défi. Il faut qu'il y ait la sécurité pour permettre aux humanitaires.
And this is why we also said that we have to work together with the humanitarian aid groups in order to better the situation.
But Imam, can I just ask you, in your opening statement you said efficient measures are urgent now.
Vous avez dit dans votre intervention que en fait les mesures urgentes, il y a besoin de mesures urgentes. Quelles seront ces mesures urgentes?
Can you just outline what the efficient measures would be?
Quelles seraient ces mesures urgentes qu'il faudrait prendre?
En matière de sécurité. En matière de sécurité?
In security.
Well, this is why I'm asking, because I did not quite know what he was referring to, you know.
Question parce que vous avez dit ça dans votre intervention et je n'étais pas sûr ce que vous voulez dire.
J'ai voulu dire que l'urgence actuelle de la République centrafricaine, c'est l'insécurité. Qu'il faut éradiquer l'insécurité.
Well, what I meant was there's an urgency to end the situation of insecurity.
Parce que quand il y a la sécurité, les ONG, les humanitaires vont revenir et la population va retrouver confiance et la cohésion sociale va aussi vite se rétablir.
Because when there is a security, more NGOs and humanitarian aid groups can come to the country, can comfort the people, and thus life can go back on its normal tracks.
C'est ça l'urgence que nous avons demandé.
This is the urgency that we have asked for.
Je voulais simplement aussi dire que il y a un équilibre à trouver.
I'd also like to say that there must be a balance that needs to be found.
Vous pouvez arriver et obliger quelqu'un à vous donner son arme.
You can actually go somewhere and actually also force somebody to hand over their arms.
Si la personne n'est pas convaincue du sens, elle va encore chercher une autre arme.
And if the person is not convinced that this is meaningful, it will, after having handed over by force his or her arms, will go and look for more arms.
Voilà pourquoi nous devons aussi appuyer sur l'éducation.
This is why we also must actually insist on the necessity for more education.
Expliquer qu'on peut trouver des solutions à travers la parole, à travers l'éducation.
And also try to tell people that the solution can also be found by using the words and education.
Et que ce n'est pas la violence qui apportera la solution à nos problèmes.
And that violence is not a way to find a solution to our problems.
Cette deuxième proposition, elle est longue et ça demande beaucoup de patience parce qu'on n'a pas le résultat palpable immédiat.
And this is of course something which takes a long time because you don't get immediate results.
Thank you very much. Well, patience was raised here, and I think maybe in the last round I can ask before we hand to the floor for questions. Are we having enough patience with crisis areas? Whoever wants to start.
Well, I think most crises of today, regardless if it's the conflict in CAR or the Ebola crisis in Western Africa at the moment, are caused by underlying reasons, and often strong governance is part of that. So if you look specifically at the Central African crisis, it's a combination of a development crisis, with indeed poor levels of education, low economical incomes, as well as a protection crisis, as well as a conflict. And so you cannot solve the humanitarian crisis, the protection crisis, or the developmental crisis without taking the other two into account. And that is the challenge of the Central African Republic, is that indeed, and there I definitely agree, you need a comprehensive approach where different actors and different institutes, because when I talk about humanitarian actors, I actually include the UN, but I also include our governments, because at the end when we talk about change in politics and governments, we're talking about our governments. And if our governments are not willing to make that change, it's because our populations in my country, like the Netherlands, are not willing for their governments to make that change. So also there we as individuals have, I think, a duty to make that known and to try to influence that, that state of mind of the populations in the countries which maybe have something to give. And so in general, I think it will be, certainly in a situation like the Central African Republic, will not be solved today. I have big problems with the Minister of France who visited in December the Central African Republic and said, oh well, we're going to pull part of our army out because this situation is better now. And we were a little bit in shock to hear that, because we think the situation in CAR is far from solved, and it's very quickly tumbling in a silent crisis, as we call that. And we think the time is now where maybe the security situation has slightly improved, but is still significantly worse than it was before March 2013, to actually try to address those three big issues: protection, humanitarian crisis, but also the development. Because indeed, as long as, I'm really sorry, but specifically the men in the Central African Republic have no income, have no education, there's not much left than armed actors in criminality.
Thank you very much.
I very much agree. But I think that there are many other real politics which choose which countries humanitarians actually are going to or will be going to. One thing is funds, that is a fact. And the other thing are other issues such as security concerns. It was mentioned today, counterterrorism was mentioned this morning. It's becoming more and more a challenge for humanitarians actually to work in countries where this applies. And I think in a way that I would like to come back to the humanitarian principles. I think that they were also mentioned by our colleagues. The humanitarian principles of humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality remain important. And I think for humanitarian actors, it is important to stick to them. We are being called old-fashioned, kind of isolistic, I don't know what, a lot of things when we talk about the principles, because they are not in fashion any longer, and we all have to work together now, which I just said we have, but not necessarily all on development, and there is still an issue of humanitarian aid and principles. Needs-based humanitarian aid remains relevant, even if we have to see how we make the links to development, to education, to do, first of all, conflict prevention, which hasn't been very much addressed by states, because conflict prevention doesn't show any immediate results. I think also from our side as humanitarian actors, especially I work on advocacy and together with many of my colleagues here, and that is something which is extremely slow. You have to repeat the message and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and maybe after 5 or 6 years, something happens. And that, of course, is, I mean, we can live with that as a job. For our colleagues who live it in their lives, it might be very, very frustrating. And I think that there's often the feeling that as a humanitarian community, we are letting down people in the different crises. But I think really that we have to continue, and we have to insist that humanitarian aid in conflict needs the principles and needs security, and in a way we have a lot of law, legal frameworks, guidelines in place, how the different actors should behave, non-state actors, government actors, other military forces. The main challenge is the implementation. And that is where we as civil society have a role to play, to insist and not to give up, to support populations who need it.
Thank you very much, which is a very nice ending for our first round, but I would now suggest we use like the last 25 minutes we still have left. If you have any questions in the audience or would like to add something, please go ahead. Yes. Are we getting a microphone? Yes.
Thank you. My question refers to Mr. Kobine and Mr. Nzapalainga. How important do you think are the natural resources in this conflict, especially the gold and diamond mines, and of course the business and the money behind it? And the second question is, do you see an abuse of this war and this conflict to exploit these resources? Thank you.
Notre pays est un pays riche en ressources naturelles.
We have a lot of natural resources indeed in our country.
On trouve du diamant, de l'or.
There are diamonds and gold.
Du pétrole, l'uranium.
Uranium.
Toutes ces richesses naturelles attirent des convoitises.
And of course, all these natural resources are sought for.
Et beaucoup de gens à l'extérieur comme à l'intérieur utilisent des Centrafricains pour avoir accès à ces ressources.
And actually, a lot of people in the country and outside the country also use their influences in order to have access to these natural resources.
Actuellement, où il y a la guerre, il y a le diamant de Centrafrique qui prend le chemin de Dubaï, le chemin du Cameroun, du Tchad et du Soudan.
And actually, for the time being, the diamonds actually travel through Dubai, Cameroon, Chad, and other places.
Je suis allé à l'intérieur du pays il y a 2 semaines. On m'a expliqué qu'il y a un monsieur blanc qui est arrivé avec des munitions et il échangeait avec les diamants.
And actually, 2 weeks ago, I spoke to somebody and I was told that there is a white person actually who comes and brings ammunition and exchanges ammunition against diamonds.
Ce qui veut dire que les ressources naturelles ne nous attirent pas que des bienfaits, bien au contraire, à cause de ces ressources-là, notre avenir est quand même compliqué.
And this is why it's true that those natural resources are not only something which is good for the country, but they also, attract people's attention and provide the grounds for conflict.
Il y a un grand problème de ressources humaines dans le sens où il y a eu problème de malgouvernance.
And there's a problem with these natural resources also, that at the same time there is really bad governance of the country.
Vous avez parfois un petit groupe qui est à la tête et qui monopolise toutes les richesses à leur profit.
And very often, because the government is non-existent or very weak, there are small groups of people who actually monopolize the access to certain natural resources.
D'où la frustration de part et d'autre.
And this gives rise to a lot of frustration, of course.
Et les gens qui regardent ce qui se passe se préparent à être des rebelles, se préparent aussi à prendre leur revanche pour arriver au pouvoir et faire la même chose.
So a lot of people actually would like to take revenge and actually try to get arms actually to fight against the people who are monopolizing it, and in order actually to get access to natural resources and to very often just do the same thing actually.
Nous pensons et espérons que si on donne la chance à tous les Centrafricains, sans distinction de religion, de race, de culture, chacun peut apporter sa contribution.
And there must be equal opportunities for each and everybody, regardless of their faith or conviction, and in this way each and everybody can also provide their part of the share of the work.
Et l'égalité des chances commence par l'école.
And equal opportunities always start with school education.
L'exploitation des richesses se fait en ce moment d'une manière individuelle parce que les structures de l'État n'existent pas dans les zones minières.
And that the using and the extraction of mineral resources are done on a sort of individual basis because there is no real administration or a government of the country.
Le gouvernement n'a ni militaire ni gendarme pour pouvoir assurer ses responsabilités régaliennes. L'État n'a plus de gendarmes.
And the government does not have soldiers or police forces anymore to carry out their duties.
Donc pour le moment, ceux qui sont à l'intérieur et à l'extérieur, qui profitent, qui exploitent les richesses, sont les ennemis du retour de la paix, sont les ennemis de la cohésion sociale.
And the ones actually who exploit the natural resources and extract the minerals are the ones who are the enemies of peace and reconstruction.
C'est pourquoi dans nos plaidoyers, nous n'avons jamais cessé de demander le renforcement de la capacité du gouvernement à fonctionner.
And this is why whenever we're talking to people, we're always trying to insist on the fact that there must be a government, a good administration again.
Next question was here.
Yes, hello, my name is Gernot Ritthaler. I'm from Caritas Germany, and I think I fully subscribe to what everybody has said on the panel, that peace can only come from within, from civil society, and it's a great example. You, as these interreligious leaders, take the lead in that. Now, today you're here in Vienna, and I know you're touring Europe many times and trying to bring your message across. At the same time, you go to the villages, as you have just told us. But of course, only what you can do within your leadership is also limited through the capacities you have, and you're dealing with a country twice as big as France. So can you tell us a little bit also about the limits of what you can do, and what is your strategy to go really deeper into the country, to reach as many people as possible within your religious, and what maybe also the international community can help you very practically, that you reach out also to more priests, to more imams, who at the end are the ones who need to convince and continue the job which you are starting at the very top, but it only can work if it goes really deeper into the country and trickles down, and there must be limitations. So can you tell us a little bit more about these challenges and maybe whether there's any kind of support also organizations like ours can help you?
So just to clarify, your question was where are the limits of what they are doing now, and could a foreign like religious aid organization help them, or what was your...
Yeah, where are the limits? How also to help us understand, they can only reach maybe 2, 3, 5 villages, but how far can they go? But is there anything they can get in support that they can reach further?
Okay, thank you.
Il faut davantage aller au village, et quelles sont donc vos limites et vos stratégies? Et que peuvent apporter en fait les ONG, les organisations de charité en fait?
Je dirais que le travail que nous faisons, nous avons aussi nos limites. Nous avons des limites et nous avons aussi des défis pour nous permettre de travailler. Certes, vous savez, la plateforme vient d'avoir un secrétariat technique qui fonctionne à temps plein. Donc la structure est déjà existante pour nous permettre de travailler.
So there is an existing structure with the Intercreed platform, the interreligious platform, and yes, it is true that of course we are encountering certain limits where we can't go beyond.
Nous avons toutefois plusieurs fois nous sortons, nous faisons des plaidoyers, nous ne présentons jamais les défis de la plateforme, les difficultés de la plateforme.
And it's true that we never actually hardly ever talk about the challenges and the issues that the platform is confronted with.
Comme nous venons pour la population, nous ne parlons que de la population, mais la plateforme certes travaille en faveur de la population. Pour nous permettre d'aller constamment en province, il faut avoir aussi des moyens logistiques conséquents parce que l'état de nos routes est tellement dégradant.
And it's true that the religious platform also helps us to be able to go out to the villages, but this is very difficult, and the limits are very often also the very difficult and unpaved roads.
Nous sommes des religieux, quand on va vers la population meurtrie, si nous partons sans quelque chose à la main, on va aller retrouver les enfants malades, les femmes en difficulté, les hommes affamés. Alors il faudrait que les ONG peuvent aussi nous aider vraiment à réunir ces conditions pour pouvoir nous permettre de faire l'avant-garde, d'aller sur le terrain, préparer le terrain aux humanitaires pour rencontrer les bénéficiaires.
And it is, of course, with the help of ONGs and also with donations that we can be helped. Because very often when we go to those villages, when we talk to the people in need, those people are really in need also of certain things, of medication or whatever it is, food that they need. So through the NGOs, they can also help us to be able to provide foodstuffs, medication, or whatever it is to the population.
Moi, je suis pasteur. Quand je décide d'aller en tournée, je pars avec un médecin, des infirmiers, des médicaments.
And actually, usually, you know, I'm a priest, and whenever I go out to the villages, I usually do so accompanied by a doctor and a nurse.
Je pars aussi avec l'équipe de Caritas, avec le matériel, c'est-à-dire les habits, les savons et tout ce qu'il faut.
And I also go out with the material that are by Caritas, with soap, with clothes.
Les villages les plus reculés n'ont plus de centre de santé.
And the remotest villages, they don't have a health care center anymore.
On commence la consultation parfois à 18 heures, on termine à minuit.
And we very often then start, you know, the medical help and attention at 6 o'clock in the evening, and very often we work until midnight.
Dans un village, les gens nous ont dit depuis 2 ans, on n'a pas vu de médecin ni un infirmier.
And actually, very often we go to villages and the people there tell us that they have not received the attention of a doctor or a nurse for more than 2 years or up to 2 years.
Certains villages sont pris en otage par les milices. Si nous arrivons à passer, on amène au moins du savon ou du sucre à ces populations.
And very often these villages are taken hostage by the militia forces, so at least what we're trying to do is to get some soap or sugar across to be able to give to the people in those remote villages.
Apporter des habits, c'est redonner la dignité à quelqu'un.
And actually providing clothes to people means to help them to restore their dignity.
C'est ce travail que Caritas fait aussi.
And this is also something which Caritas does.
Thank you. So as we are quickly running out of time, I would suggest we collect a few questions. You had one, I think there was a lady over there. Here, yes, here. So 3 questions, yeah, let's collect them. If they get a microphone, yes.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for sharing all your views and experience on the topic. My question goes to Karoline Kleijer, and it's about, you said that in order to have a humanitarian space where you can work, in which you can work, you need to negotiate with all the armed groups. How do you approach them? Do you try to identify their leaders, or do you go to them individually, or how do you talk to those people?
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Stephanie Beil, and my question refers to a statement of Kathrin Schick. You said that humanitarian aid is mostly dependent on political issues. In what extent is that true, or do you think of the possibility how one can do humanitarian aid independent of different political issues? Thank you.
One here and one over there.
Après votre visite, est-ce que vous retournez encore une fois là-bas en village pour voir si ils ont apprécié les choses que vous avez amenées? English?
Do you actually, after your visits to those villages, do you actually, if I understood that correctly, go back afterwards to the villages in order to see whether there has been a follow-up and how those people are doing sometime after you first visited them?
I also ask a question to the Central African representative, so I speak French. Merci pour avoir venu ici et partager votre expérience en Centrafrique. Ma question, c'est un peu pour l'avenir, parce que j'ai compris que la population est vraiment séparée pour le moment, que la plupart des musulmans a fui le pays. Et je voulais demander, qu'est-ce que vont vos perspectives à rétablir la paix entre la population chrétienne et la population musulmane, puisqu'ils peuvent vivre ensemble un jour dans l'avenir? Je crois que beaucoup la confiance était détruite par la violence que vous avez expérimentée, et je me demande vraiment comment vous pouvez retourner ensemble. My question was basically just, since there has been so much violence between Christians and Muslims, how to re-establish peace and confidence between these two groups, since so many Muslims have fled the country and the communities are living separate right now. So how can we come back to the situation that has been there before?
Thank you very much. So, yeah, we take one more. Okay.
Thank you. Michael Meyerhofer, I was working with GSZ in Afghanistan until the end of last year. I have actually an addition to the first question. Very often in conflict scenarios, informal local authorities can facilitate communication between the foreign donors or local populations, and as well armed non-state actors. I would be interested, what is the situation in Central African Republic? Is there a possibility to have local respected elders or similar authorities who can open channels of communication to the armed groups and in order to negotiate access to the affected areas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we can take this question together with the first one, right? How do you negotiate with rebel groups, and are there other channels that can open a route to negotiate with them?
Well, to negotiate humanitarian space, or negotiate access as we sometimes call it, it's a job. That's also why we say we have to, together, all of us need to be better at it, because it's a job, and you can actually, I think we can still gain more space. I think many organizations, actors, UN actors, can actually, even donors, can still negotiate more space. But it's a job. It's not something you do in your evenings. It's actually a full-time job almost. The way we do it is that we actually approach it quite holistic, I would say. So there is one thing about talking to armed actors themselves, and what is very important in that is that talking to armed actors is not about talking to the generals alone. Talking to armed actors means you talk to the general, you talk, but also to the little commanders on the ground. Because specifically in countries like the Central African Republic, but also today Syria, it's hard to find clear leaders. So you actually have to negotiate on all levels, but specifically in the geographical area you want to work. So there you talk to the local commanders and you actually negotiate space. Now that starts with good programs. You can only actually ask for space to work and operate if you're perceived well, if they appreciate you being there. Now there are several things to that. For sure, it is the principles of being neutral, not being seen as taking a side, being impartial, being humanitarian, not coming with mixed politics, not having a bigger agenda. You're there to help individual people. Yeah? So, but that also comes with being relevant. So not having activities which we might think, or I might think is relevant, but coming with activities which are relevant for the population, for the people. And of course not being naive in there, you also want to be relevant for the armed actors you negotiate with. Often there is something to gain from them. Often armed actors are or partly part of this population, or they actually have something to gain by feeling appreciated by the population. They're living in that area as well. So if the armed actor thinks that they can use you to show to a population, like, look, we're good for you because we brought in these actors to help you, you have something to gain. So you have to do a big analysis of what the interests are of the different parties. Now, how to get in contact with them, it differs. Once, many years ago, when I came for the first time to the Central African Republic, and the Seleka was called, I think, the UFDR mainly at that time, we actually went to their website to find an email address and a phone number, and that's how we approached them, because they were a very small little group in the far northeast Fagaga of Kar. But at the same time, often it comes down to networking, to talking to the religious leaders, to talking to the political leaders, to talk to the people in the town, the person who's running the restaurant, and asking for networks, asking how it works. And then you build on that. For MSF specifically, only 10% of our personnel is actually international. 90% is from the country. So we use them to ask, like, well, how does it work? Who do you think we should approach? Who should we not approach? So you use the competencies of both the international staff, who are earlier considered neutral, who are earlier, for example, in hospitals when armed actors come in. And we have seen in the Central African that militia groups came in to actually even kill patients inside their beds. We have seen that it made a difference if there is a foreign doctor standing there and saying, please, this is a hospital. Just the fact that a man like that is standing there, or a woman, can make the difference between armed militia entering a hospital, yes or no. But the big how is very much networking on all levels. And all levels is specifically, and that's often forgotten, the local geographical area, so the smallest commanders on the field you can find, but as well reaching out to all their political connections, international, national, religious, etc. So that's a bit how it works. But it all starts with neutrality, independence, and good activities, good programs.
Yeah, well, neutrality, it's a good point for the question you got. Are we choosing where we help with political factors?
I think it's a very good question, because humanitarian aid is part of all foreign departments of EU member states. So it means absolutely that it is part of the political tools which a government has. So in that way, it's political. When you are a humanitarian actor in conflict, we all strive to implement, to follow as much as we can the humanitarian principles. And I think CAR is a very good example. You cannot choose one group to the other. Then you are not neutral. If you go too much with the military, you will probably also have a problem to actually do your work. So you are a political actor in the choices you have to make. But humanitarian action should follow the principles. Now, then there is the other thing, which is that we, as NGOs, as civil society, we are also political actors in the way the advocacy we do. We can go to our governments and say that the most vulnerable, handicapped, elder people should, for example, be supported first. We can say that more long-term development is needed. We can go together with our colleagues. So we have also a role there to actually build the bridge between governments who fund and who have to do political decisions. Because that's my last thing. What we see now is that more and more governments choose to give money to countries where they have business interests or where they have a colonial power. I must say that in the case of France, with Central African Republic, maybe it wasn't too bad because they put the army immediately because they had a lot of business interests, but they had a historical link. So it can go both ways, but what we as humanitarians say is funding should go where the needs are the biggest. And it should be the humanitarians together with the affected people who should define which needs are most important. And what we see now is that more and more governments put aid and go and say, look how fantastic we are, and this is the best visible aid. So that's the nuances. Politics is always complex, but I think it's important to make the difference between the fields and the politics, how humanitarian aid is used, because no political solution is found by the politicians.
Thank you. So, which leaves us with the gentleman. I think the two questions will actually play into each other. You were asked if you ever go back to villages to find out if some peace you established is holding, which I think also in part answers the question that came from over there, how to restore trust.
En effet, on retourne à l'occasion dans les villages, et à chaque fois qu'on arrive dans le village, c'est une grande joie, le sourire aux lèvres pour les populations.
So whenever we go back to a village, people are very pleased and they have a smile on their faces to see us come back to the villages.
Et nous voyons les autorités, les chefs, les enfants, beaucoup de gens viennent autour de nous pour écouter les nouvelles, soit de la capitale ou du monde.
And very often they all gather around us. It's you know, the children, but also the political leaders of the villages, in order to find out news from us, news maybe about the capital of the country, or maybe also news from outside the country.
À la question posée, est-ce que les deux communautés musulmanes et chrétiennes peuvent vivre ensemble? Je dirais oui, il est possible.
Now, regarding the question whether Muslims and Christians will be able to live together again, I would say yes, that will be the case.
Dans une ville qui s'appelle Yaloké, on avait trouvé 700 musulmans qui étaient en perdition. Nous les avons ramenés dans la ville.
And actually, there was a village where we went, and 700 Muslims who lived there actually had to leave the village, and we helped them to be able to get back to the village.
Nous avons demandé à Madame le sous-préfet, le maire, les chefs, s'ils pouvaient accepter que les gens viennent habiter dans le village.
And we actually asked the representatives of the local government there to have those Muslims back in the community, and this is the way it worked out, by us talking to the regional political leaders there.
Ils ont dit, ce sont nos frères, et nous les avons accueillis dans le village. La date d'aujourd'hui, aucun villageois n'a pris une arme pour leur tirer dessus, ni vice-versa. Donc ça veut dire qu'il y a un début déjà d'une cohabitation.
And actually, those people have been able to stay in those villages, and nobody has actually taken to the arms and shot at them. So this is quite a success story.
Ce que nous voulons, c'est que les enfants musulmans et chrétiens doivent se retrouver dans la même école pour étudier.
And what we would like to see is a situation where Muslim children and Christian children go together to the same school.
Nous voulons aussi que les hommes viennent rencontrer d'autres hommes musulmans pour réfléchir, travailler ensemble.
And we'd also like to see Muslims and Christians meet, get together in order to deliberate, think and discuss things together.
Nous voulons aussi que les femmes puissent retrouver les femmes musulmanes pour aller au champ, aller aussi au marché, faire des activités ensemble.
And the same goes for women, so that women can go out to the fields again, can go to the markets again.
La situation des autorités locales capables de faire pour faciliter la communication est plus complexe.
But the issue about the local political leaders and what they have to say for a good living together is a very complex issue.
La dernière crise que nous avons vécue a fait voler en éclats l'autorité des chefs du village.
And actually the last crisis that we have experienced has actually produced the political leaders to really lose their influence.
Ce sont les gens qui ont des armes qui pensent avoir l'autorité.
Because it's the people, the armed people, who believe that they have seized the authority.
Vous pouvez avoir un différend dans un village, on amènera le problème chez le anti-Balaka, chez le milicien, plutôt que chez le chef du village.
And very often when there's conflicts and when there is issues to be resolved in those villages, those conflicts are not taken before the conventional, the traditional leaders of the villages or the political leaders, but they're rather taken and reported to the Balaka or anti-Seleka, the armed rebel movements.
Nous travaillons à ce que chacun retrouve sa place. Le jeune n'est pas préparé à trancher des différends et aussi l'adulte doit prendre sa posture pour pouvoir décider pour les problèmes qui peuvent survenir ou bien faciliter les rencontres avec les autorités.
So we're trying to do our best in order to help remedy the situation so that the political leaders and the traditional leaders can come back into their sphere of influence.
Certes, pendant la crise, on a constaté une exode massive de la communauté musulmane.
It is true that during the crisis, many Muslims fled their villages or even the country.
Parce qu'à travers la crise centrafricaine, il y avait aussi une stratégie de diviser le pays.
Because one of the strategies of this armed conflict was also to divide the country in two parts.
Donc pour les partisans de la division du pays, ils voulaient organiser cet exode massif pour permettre à réussir à déplacer les musulmans dans le nord.
And this is why actually part of the strategy consisted in trying to place the Muslim population into the north of the country.
C'est pourquoi ils ont utilisé la fibre religieuse. Ils ont instrumentalisé la religion.
And this is why religion was instrumentalized by the armed forces.
Comme il y a eu échec de diviser le pays, et les Centrafricains ont compris qu'on a voulu les diviser, ils ont commencé aussi à changer de mentalité.
And there has been a change of mentality when the people, after it was seen that it was not possible, that the militia and armed forces did not succeed in producing a division of the country.
Aujourd'hui, le nombre de déplacés musulmans au Tchad comme au Cameroun n'est pas le même, c'est un rabais.
And actually, the Muslims which have fled to Cameroon and Chad, these numbers are decreasing again.
dans la ville de Bangui, le quartier, le 3e arrondissement qui était vide, qui était presque vidé, a une croissance importante du retour des musulmans.
And many Muslims have actually found their way back to the 3rd district of Bangui, the capital, and this 3rd district was almost empty.
Même dans certaines communes, les musulmans ont commencé à repartir dans leurs villages respectifs.
And Muslims have also been able to go back to the villages where they come from.
Et que nous sommes optimistes que le vivre ensemble redeviendra une réalité.
So we're quite optimistic that it will be possible in the future that Muslims and Christians will again be able to live together.
Dans le pays, certes, il y a des autorités dont leur voix porte encore.
And there are still authorities in the country whose words are still valuable.
Donc toute la communauté internationale, les Centrafricains savent que seules les autorités religieuses ont encore cette force de ramener la paix dans le pays.
And many people know that actually it is only the religious leaders who have remained who have a lot of power to, or have a lot of responsibility, and the people listen to them still.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And so we are ending on a positive note, because you don't give up hope, and you think living together is possible. Well, yeah, we overstretched our time a little bit, but I think it was very interesting. Thank you very much for the work you're doing. All the best to you. All the best to you. And thank you also to the audience. I'd just like to add a little organizational note. There is now a roughly 1 hour lunch break, which will last until 1:30. Thank you very much.